Good afternoon, good evening. How many of you love history? Ooh, okay. Yes, history is fascinating. History is also very contentious. And, you know, all of us have been taught a version of history in India, which, to put it mildly, is utter bilge, right? More fiction, less fact, or a combination, judicious combination of the two. But thankfully, we now have new writers who are challenging established narratives. You know, writers like Vikram Sampath, Abbas Maldahiyar, and Anirudh comes from that illustrious line. And so I'm very, very happy to be here. So let's get started. I don't want to. By the way, before I start, how many of you know the kings of the Mughals? How many Mughal kings do you know? 3, 5, 6, 4. So, oh, okay. Mr. Manishankar Iyer knows 9. I know 6. I think most people would know, Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. How many years do you think that was, roughly, till Aurangzeb? No. It's 1526 is Babur, right? When the Battle of Panipat. 1705 or 7 is Aurangzeb's death. So it's about 180 years. How many of you can tell me the names of Chora kings? Okay, sir, can you? Just 2. Right. Vijayalaya Chora, Aditya Chora, Parantaka Chora, Kandaraditya Chora, Arinjaya Chora, Sundara Chora, Uttama Chora, Rajaraja 1, Rajendra 1, Rajadi Raja 1, Rajendra 2. How many years is that? That goes from 848 to 1063. That's more than 200 years. And the Choras continued till about the middle of the 13th century, before the Pandyas took over. Okay? So we know 175 years of Mughal history really well. My kids went through Mughal history 3 times in like 6 years. They had probably like half a paragraph or half a page on the Choras. Okay, this is what we've been taught. And so I was just delighted when I saw that Anirudh had written about the Choras. We need more such writers. So let me get started. All right, so why don't we, he's an engineer, right? You went to BITS Pilani.
Yes, I went to the Goa campus before you think I was too studious.
Hey, that's still studious enough for us, okay? How did you get into history? Can you talk about your journey as an author?
Well, it all began with, I promise, with me not studying in college. I had a 0% attendance requirement. I think that BITS Pilani was quite forward-thinking in doing that. I also had access to very high-speed LAN internet, which meant that I spent most of my college life playing video games. Now, as most of you would know, video games tend to be an industry that's dominated by the West. So a lot of the historical video games I was playing were based on European history. And I found that when I developed a curiosity about Alexander or Julius Caesar, I was very easily able to find well-researched, well-written, accessible books that did not presume any degree of academic knowledge for me to be able to read them. As I began to get curious about the history of India, and I consider myself to be, or at least in college, I was as well read as I think most young Indians are. But when I began to read Indian history, most of the books that I could find were academic works. And I found that there's a certain entry barrier for the average Indian to read them. While these are spectacular works of scholarship, these are based on extensive decades worth of research and specialization, they are very often written for audiences that already have a certain degree of knowledge. And I've increasingly seen over the last decade that while Indians are tremendously curious about our history, we don't always have the resources to be able to satisfy that in a critical and intelligent way. Very often we have to rely on relatively low quality information on YouTube, on social media. Um, Rather than, just to give you a recent example, I had a fantastic interview with Professor George Michel, the great architectural historian. I was talking to him at Aivole, the early Chalukya capital, about the origins of Karnataka's temple architecture. And every now and then I have the rather masochistic tendency to read comments on my social media posts and video interviews. And I happened to, out of curiosity, look at some of the comments. And while a lot of folks were appreciating Dr. Michel for his knowledge, they were also pointing out that a certain YouTuber who thinks that ancient Indian temples were actually transformers built by aliens from space was an equally credible voice when it comes to temple architecture. And I don't blame the people who are making these comments, right? It's a factor of the information ecosystem that we're always surrounded by. And what I realized in college and what I really try to do through my career so far and hopefully for the next few decades is to bridge that gap. I want to make it easier for young Indians to access critical, well thought out historical works. I want there to be a healthy sense of respect and debate around academic history. I think that some sections of the political spectrum go a little too far in criticizing academics and turning against the received wisdom. And I think that the simplest solution to that is simply to level the playing field. So in my books, what I do is, in addition to weaving together critical interdisciplinary research, I also build narratives that are easy for you all to read, hopefully. And I also make sure that all my arguments, all my claims are backed by hard citations. I've got into multiple long debates with my editors over how long the bibliography section of my books can be. But I've always insisted that for us to be able to correct the imbalance in our perception of the history, which tends to be focused on the Gangetic Plains, as South India once again reclaims its position on the historical stage, as South Indian voices once again begin to tell our histories, we must base what we're saying on evidence and on facts rather than on myth and emotion. So that's the rambling answer to your question.
No, it's a fascinating answer, and we'll dig a little deeper into it. What I found when I was reading your book is that you have a very distinct narrative voice. So can you talk a little bit about that? How did you develop that style? Was it conscious? Did you try to make it so because you wanted to differentiate yourself from those who had come before you? Or is it just your way of expressing the story that lies underneath?
Well, I would love to say that my writing is a conscious process. It's mostly just me hammering away at my keyboard and seeing what sticks. But I entered into writing long-form nonfiction through podcasting. And back in 2017, I made this podcast called Echoes of India, which was, at the time, I think one of only two English language Indian history podcasts. And right from the outset, I wanted this podcast to feel like the National Geographic documentaries I'd grown up watching. I wanted them to feel immersive. I wanted the voices of experts and of people from the past to shine through. And I also wanted to give a sense of these incredible cultures and peoples that we all descend from. And the thing with the podcasting format is that you can't rely on anything visual. You have to create a description, a mental picture that's vivid enough, that's suggestive enough for your listener, that their imagination does the rest of the work for you. So the very first episode that we produced for this podcast was about Alexander's invasion of North India. And we have a pretty good sense from Greek sources of what a violent confrontation this was. It happened on a stormy night on the banks of the river Jhelum. The Greeks actually crossed while the Indian camp was resting for the night in the middle of a storm. And I said, as I'm describing this, let's have the sounds of a storm. Let's as I'm describing the battle scene, let's have the trumpeting of elephants. Let's have the trundling of chariot wheels. And when King Porus makes his last stand in the morning against the remaining Greek forces, I said, let's put in some conch shells. Because we know from descriptions of ancient and medieval Indian battles that conch shells were used to command troops. And I still remember so distinctly a friend of mine who listened to this podcast for the first time when he was cutting vegetables told me that when he heard the conch shells, he almost sliced the tip of his finger off because he just never heard them in a podcast before. And that's really, I think, where I began to develop a narrative voice. So a lot of my writing tries to be as sensorially evocative as possible. I really immerse myself in the sources to try and give readers a sense of what this world was. What did it look like? What did it feel like to be in the temples and palaces and hovels of 1,000 years ago? I want people to feel the emotional worlds of these long forgotten folks, because once again, I want us to, I think it's important that as we're rediscovering and talking about this past again, that we don't do it in an anachronistic manner. That we don't give to people of 1,000 years ago the motivations that we have, right? So they didn't have the same conception of nationalism, they didn't have the same political impulses, they didn't necessarily even have the same moralistic impulses. But their natures were still fundamentally human. They still loved their families, they still feared their gods, they still hated their rivals. And I want to make sure that all that comes across in my work, but always based on rigorous readings of the sources. So when I'm describing, for example, the Chola queen, Sembian Mahadevi, looking at a portrait she has commissioned of her husband on her temple, that's because I have an inscription on the temple wall that says Queen Sembian Mahadevi was here on this date, and she commissioned this portrait of her husband. And her husband had passed away a few decades ago by that point. So I don't think I'm overreading the evidence when I say that her mind must have been full of emotions, right? But simply by putting that line in there, I'm able to make you suddenly identify with this person who lived 1,030 years ago. And I'm able to make you feel for her and feel invested in her story. And I create a narrative frame in which you want to know what happens next. You want to know, you know where this woman has come from. You want to see where she's going. So there's a lot of this that happens behind. Thank you all. Thank you. There's a lot of this that happens behind the scenes. It takes a lot of research, a lot of thinking, and I think a lot of empathizing to be able to do this in a way that's factually grounded, but also humane and empathetic.
So as I was listening to Anirudh speak, I felt like he was echoing a lot of my own thoughts, because as a historical fiction writer, that's basically what I do, is try and put myself in that era and then try and paint a vivid picture, right? In fact, I was very pleasantly surprised when I started reading the book. In your very first scene where Ko Kiran Adigal is sitting there and thinking about it, felt like something I would have started a book with, right? So would you call yourself a historian, a storyteller, or something in between?
I don't see why historians can't be storytellers. I think it's really what kind of story are we telling and for whom, and what are we basing the story on. I think that as a concept, history has always been about storytelling, and this applies irrespective of cultures. It simply depends, depending on one's cultural background, what kind of story is sought to be told. So if you read, for example, a dynastic history commissioned by a Chinese court, it'll be all about how, this powerful emperor followed the Confucian rituals, therefore they were a successful ruler, right? If you were to read an ecclesiastical history written in medieval Europe, it'll be about how such and such saint, such and such martyr was so devoted and put up with such and such sacrifices, but was miraculously saved and redeemed. And I think the same also applies to Puranic histories. It applies to Prashastis, royal eulogies that preface temple inscriptions. there's a particular kind of story being told that we would not consider history by our standards, but that medieval people certainly did consider history. In fact, there's a very interesting story about the Andhra Mahabharata when it was first commissioned by King Rajaraja Narendra. There's actually a section in the text where the poet Nannaya talks about how the king commissioned him to do this. And the king actually is supposed to have said, I am descended from the sun and the moon. Tell me a story of my ancestors. And I found this really interesting, and it actually makes up a good chunk of this book, because when I hear that some king 1,000 years ago said he was descended from the sun, that he was a part of the solar or lunar lineage, 5 years ago I'd have been like, man, this guy was smoking something special. But now I think, no, I see where he's coming from, because claims like this are not made by every king. They're made by the most powerful kings after they've done certain kinds of conquests, after they've performed certain kinds of rituals, and after their history has been written by particular kinds of poets in a particular language, usually Sanskrit. It's only then that kings make these claims, and very often rival kings will also make similar claims and try to take them down a notch or two. So you see, for example, that the Rashtrakuta dynasty, who ruled the northern Deccan region and defeated the Cholas in the early 10th century, the Rashtrakutas considered themselves members of the Yadava clan and descendants of the moon, because they believed that in the Kali age, that only the descendants of the sun or the moon could be kings of kings. I can see a lot of skeptical face in the audience. Believe me, I'm not making all of this up. Our conception of history as fitting to an objective chronological timeline is not how people of 1,000 years ago thought about their history. They genuinely believed that they were descended from or in the same lineage as gods. And so when the Cholas eventually overpowered the Rashtrakutas, they claim to be descendants of the sun. And then when a dynasty in Odisha tries to challenge the Cholas for supremacy on the east coast, they claim to be descendants of the moon. So these are imperial dynasties who are trying to make particular political claims and who genuinely believe that it is in a particular reading of their history that they are descended from these legendary families. And we also do the same thing, mind you. How many of you have heard of the idea that India is the oldest democracy? Yeah? Oh, just 2 people? Wow, amazing. But yes, this is something that has been said quite often, because there were certain polities in the 7th century BC in the Gangetic Plains that had some form of voting to establish political authority, take military decisions. In practice, the actual power was held by related Kshatriya clans, but that has not prevented us from reading them as democracies, because we want to establish that our way of seeing the world, our way of conducting politics has these deep and ancient antecedents. And I don't know why we think that the people of the past were not capable of doing the same thing. Yes, they live in a very different world, but they have the same impulse to connect themselves to something older than they are. They have the same impulse to, and I've read quite a lot of tantric texts written by all religions. I know it's a bit of a tangent, I'll explain why in a second. Did you know that Jains had a concept of Tantra? Yeah. So I came across this, and it's going to sound like an absolute oxymoron, a tantric ritual written by a Jain monk to explain how to get women to fall in love with you. And he actually provides this whole recipe that involves, all these like exotic like perfumes and whatnot that need to be applied to particular body parts and so on and so forth. But he's not making this up, right? He may have been, I don't know. I don't know the guy. There are other tantric texts that share a similar conception of how such and such properties of such and such materials, when used in such and such ways, will lead to such and such results, right? Now, it's not scientific the way that we think about it, but it's still systematic. It's based on accumulated knowledge and argumentation, generation across generation, by very learned teachers who are convinced that they are intellectuals. And these guys are claiming names and titles like, oh, the smiter to the hill that is the rivals. And they claim these intellectual titles from kings. In fact, we have examples of them receiving a victory certificate, Jayapatre, from kings after winning a debate. But my point is that these medieval people who we very often tend to think of as somehow simpler than us, but in a good way, right? We're like, they weren't as corrupt as we are. They were so devout, they fought for good reasons, they preserved culture. Human beings are human beings. When it suits them to claim to uphold tradition, they say so. When it suits them to break with tradition to seize power, they do so. When it suits them to be corrupt, they absolutely did so. I think that sometimes we do an injustice to our past by projecting, by not allowing the people of the past to share in the endless moral grayness that we all inhabit. They were capable of the same heights of ambition and creativity and deep thought, but also capable of greed and hate and venality. And I think it's important that we hold space for that we allow the people of the past to be flawed like we are. It's only then that we can, I think, really create a sense of the past that is believable and that explains the kind of contradictory evidence that sometimes survives.
Okay. I'm actually, when you were talking about the solar and lunar dynasties, look, we all have our Gotras, right? When somebody asks me, I say I'm a Kashmiri. Why? I'm the Kashyapa Gotra. Rishi Kashyap, Kashmir is named after Rishi Kashyap. So, yeah, call me a Kashmiri. Which brings us to an important point, right? I'm just going to shift gears a little bit. Now, as I started by saying, history is very contentious, right? There's always multiple angles, multiple camps. Also, all of us as authors and writers have our own worldviews colored by our own biases. So when you write, do you consciously make an effort to set aside your ideological moorings, whatever that might be, and write? Or do you say, okay, you know what, this is a story that I'm telling my way, and it's just another aspect that I'm going to put out?
Well, I think that history is something that is always unfolding. Not only is history always being told, it is actively being shaped. Just the very fact that we are sitting here in this room and talking about these historical ideas is going to shape the way that you think about the past, is going to shape the way that you read about the past, and so on, endlessly across all generations. Now, when I write history, I'm very aware that I'm just one in an endless line of torchbearers, that my interpretation of the past is based, at least to the extent possible, on hard facts, on hard evidence, but there will always be evidence that comes out and that might challenge the way that I think about it. So, to give you an example, I began writing this book with the idea that it would be a truly trans-regional history of the Cholas, right? I think that living today in a world of linguistic states, we sometimes tend to bracket up medieval dynasties based on modern borders. So, for example, the Cholas are a Tamil dynasty. The Gangas and Rashtrakutas are Kannada dynasties. The fact is the Cholas are very active here in the Mysore region. Right across the river, the Kaveri, at Talakad and at Mudigundam, there are Tamil-style temples that were built by merchants who moved into the region in the wake of Chola armies. About, I think, a couple of dozen kilometers northwest from Mysore, up in the foothills of the Western Ghats, there's a spectacular Sati stone commissioned by the family of a medieval noblewoman called Dekabbe. And Dekabbe committed Sati because her husband had been put to death for the crime of fratricide, for killing one of his relatives. Which king do you think gave him the order? Must have been a Kannada local king, right? Yeah? No, it was a Chola, yes. It was the Chola Emperor Rajendra II. Why was he considered an authority? Why was he appealed to? Why did he dispense justice in this region? I won't tell you because I want some of you to read the book. Oh, fantastic. Do you know the answer? Okay, okay. Tell me the answer later once you've read it. Um, okay, well, next time I'm sure. Next time I'm sure we will do it.
By the way, when I'm in one of my naughty moods, I ask my Kannada friends, so was Krishna Deva Raya a Kannada king or a Telugu king?
Ooh, troublesome question. Um, but to come to the question of how our perspectives, of how I build my perspective of the past. Now, all of us have heard the Cholas were a maritime empire. Yeah, maritime empire, yeah. Most of us have probably are familiar with the idea that Cholas ruled in Southeast Asia in some form. Yeah, that's how I began like thinking about and researching the book. So I said, okay, let's find the Chola inscriptions in Southeast Asia. And keep in mind, the Cholas loved documenting things, right? Tamil temples are covered in Chola inscriptions. Many of the most important Tamil temples to this day have an extensive layer of Chola inscriptions. So when they went overseas, they would have done the same thing, right? Because in Karnataka, in Kolar, for example, there is a Kolarama temple built by the Cholas, covered in Chola inscriptions. How many Chola inscriptions have survived from Southeast Asia? Guesses? Any guesses? None. Exactly. Actually, there are quite a few Tamil inscriptions in Southeast Asia, but they're all commissioned by merchants. And these merchants never mention a Chola king. And so I sat down and said, how is this possible? What must have happened here? Because we're pretty sure the Cholas did go to Southeast Asia. So why is it that all the inscriptional evidence, all the archaeological evidence is telling us about Tamil merchants? And then I had to sit down and think, so how did the Cholas go overseas? Where are the inscriptions about a Chora navy? I tried and I couldn't find any. And then I had to conclude that maybe the king didn't maintain a navy, but the merchants did. And this really messed with my idea of what a state should look like.
So can I come in here?
Yes,
Now,
yes.
I
Let's get
meant-
into trouble.
So
Yes.
let's liven this thing up a little.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. There are many things that I agreed with in the book. One of the things that I didn't agree with is that the Choras didn't have a navy. I'll tell you why. Okay. First, even Parantaka had a navy. I went to the Meikirti of Rajendra I and read it. It says, Alai kadal naduve pala kalam selutti. Kalam is a word specifically used for a warship. It's not used typically for a ship in general. Second, when you go to Rajaraja's Meikirti, when he went to Kandalur Salai, which was a Chera, as you know, naval base, he says again, Kalam maruthu aruli. So that word kalam, if translated correctly, implies a warship. It doesn't imply just a ship, in my opinion. Again, these are just opinions.
See, this is why historians keep getting stuck in. I mean, we do a lot of these debates, so I hope you guys are going to enjoy the ensuing discussion.
No, I have one more piece, right?
Sure.
So, and this, again, Sri Vijaya Empire was supposed to have had a large navy. How does a king who sends people on a merchant navy, it's not like they got off on land and then fought, because if he didn't have a navy, he was sending basically infantry troops on merchant ships, according to you. How does that work? How do you defeat a major naval power like the Sri Vijayas? There is evidence to show that they went and sacked Kadaram, for example, Rajendra I. So, your thoughts on it?
Okay. I'm going to be very systematic with this, okay? Kadaram or Kedah was a very important port in present-day Malaysia. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to medieval warfare, when it comes to the attacking of historical sites, there's a claim that is made by the political leaders, and there is the actual reality of what happened. So I spoke to a Malaysian archaeologist who excavated Kedah, and he didn't find evidence of destruction. There was a shifting of the settlement area, which I think would suggest the Cholas did raid there. But Kedah is a port on land. If you look at Rajendra Chola's inscription, when he describes his attack on the king of Kedah, he says that he captured the king with his rutting elephants. Elephants are not fighting on water. They're not fighting on the sea. This automatically implies that there was an element to the conflict that happened on land. Second, when you think about the inscriptions of the Bridishwara temple, right? The inscriptions on the temple are the most comprehensive record we have of the structure of the Chola state. There are dozens and dozens of army regiments that are mentioned. We know the names of these army regiments. There was actually a regiment called the Karnataka Strongheads, which I find quite interesting. But not a single naval regiment is named. Not a single naval captain is named. We know the names of individual generals, senapatis, who made gifts in temples across Tamil Nadu, not the name of a single naval officer. As for Rajaraja's attack on Kandalur, there have been multiple interpretations of the inscription, as you've said. Cutting the vessel in the hall is one interpretation. But other scholars favor the interpretation that he simply set fire to merchant ships that were at port. So, once again, I'm not saying all this necessarily to say that I absolutely know they didn't have a navy. I'm saying that we shouldn't automatically assume they had a navy because modern states have navies. I'm saying that we should be open to the idea that medieval states generated military power in a multitude of different ways. Because we have merchant inscriptions that talk about different kinds of ships. We have merchant inscriptions that talk about the taxation of ships. We have merchant inscriptions that talk about military regiments that they maintained in Sri Lanka, for example. So we know that corporate bodies outside of the state structure also had military forces. Now, if the Cholas had a navy, then A, it would have required significant investment to construct and significant investment to upkeep. Where is this in the inscriptions? We have detailed records of army regiments moving around, being posted in different places, no records of naval regiments being posted. The navy of Parantaka Chola that you mentioned is based on one vague claim that the king set his eyes on the shores of Lanka. But we know that trade was happening between Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu for centuries before that. It would have been a fairly intuitive affair to have coastal vessels that were being used by traders that could also be used to transport infantry forces. Because all these are land-based states. Their revenues coming from agriculture, their wartime loot is coming from attacking cities. It's not coming from ship-to-ship combat on the high seas. If that was happening, we would have depictions of it in temple sculpture, which we don't. But we do have depictions of, I can see the organizers, sorry, I've gotten a bit carried away. But I mean, this is the point. Look, like I said, if evidence shows up of a Chola navy, I will be delighted because it will change what we know about the nature of how states operate, how states got revenue, how states deployed naval forces, right? But until we reach the point where we have the evidence, we can't just rely on hunches and hints. We have to look at exactly what the evidence tells us and read it conservatively and allow it to challenge us sometimes, just as you have challenged me. So, how much? Do we have 10 minutes? 10 minutes? Okay. 7 minutes, okay.
My question to you is, someone like me who reads history, who likes to read history, now because of tools like AI tools, it is easier in my opinion to do research. If I want to, for example, when I read your book, Lords of the Deccan, or if I read another really good book I've read recently, Scouting India by Nandini Das, I find opportunities where I feel like, hey, I can dive a little deeper into this and do some research. What are the avenues for outsiders like me to submit not books or manuscripts, but at least just articles, for example, which can be peer reviewed in terms of the research being done? Are there avenues or conferences where outsiders like me can try and engage so that our interest gets more focus and possibly helps people like you?
So you're talking about academic platforms?
Anything, like even for example, if somebody like me wants to volunteer to help you with your next book, and the interest is only to do research in a focused way, right? Not just writing a personal blog, for example.
Well, a lot of how I started was simply by writing blogs. I found a small community of history enthusiasts through that. And then I moved on to podcasting and eventually into long form writing. Um, but I would say, generally speaking, there are enough history enthusiasts out there that as you start to create and put your work up online, people will begin to find you. Um, it might not necessarily lead directly to a book, but there's no reason. I think that everybody can and should be talking about and writing about history and putting in citations and footnotes and evidence. Um, Honestly, this is going to be a bit unconventional of a suggestion, but Reddit Indian history forums are pretty smart and pretty well informed. There's a Dravidology subreddit, which like these guys like are sharing like peer-reviewed like linguistics papers and like arguing about word borrowings in Proto-South Dravidian and stuff. So I think that's a great place to start. So, good question.
Hi, I think I've got the mic for the next
Hello,
one.
hello.
This might be a controversial question for a historian, but do you guys have a favorite phase in history, or does that change depending on what book you're writing?
Do you want to take this first?
Well, there's a difference, I think. Okay, there's a similarity in what we do, which is write about history. This thing is historical fiction, so I'm a little less constrained. So Lee Child, if you have read his Reacher books, in one of his master classes says, if there is a choice between what is plausible and what is factual, always choose the plausible as a writer of fiction, right? It makes it more interesting. So my idea, okay, so you've all heard that old African saying, right? That until the lion learns to write, the story will always be about the hunt. What's happened, so what I'm trying to do is tell our stories. I think right now, Indians are starting to tell their stories themselves. We've been fed stories, and as Naipaul said, when he said this about journalists, but he could have said this about Indian writers, where he said, Indian journalists have no independent journalist tradition or something like that. They look on India with a Western lens. So personally, what I try to do is write from an Indic lens. I have a very Indic view of the way I write. And so, for example, my first trilogy was the Battle of Vatapi trilogy, which was set between the Chalukyas and the Pallavas in 7th century CE. The recent book, Daughter of Two Rivers, is set in 1800 BCE, between the Sindhu Saraswati and the Babylonian civilizations. So I think history fascinates me. I don't think there's any particular period. But the older I go, the easier it becomes to write because there's less evidence, so I don't have to worry about it.
Yes, Justice Raman, please.
A question for both you guys, but one important observation I have to make about Tamil Nadu in the 50s and 60s is a lot of us were exposed to Ponniyin Selvan very early. So the Cholas, in a sense, were part of, you could say, Tamil Nadu consciousness.
Yes.
In quite an important way.
Yes.
Of course, the facts were known, but in a mixed way. I wouldn't say that there was huge research. So I think coming to both your work, particularly Anirudh's now, your latest book on the Choras, did you read Ponniyin Selvan at all in the sense that it's completely fictional, but it has got a sort of an ethos that Kalki imagined India to be at that time, and I think he had a very powerful imagination, right? And did it have any bearing at all on your work? And what about you, Arun, because you're from the area? So just a question from the left field, really.
So definitely, I did read Ponniyin Selvan, and I find it very interesting also as a product of Tamil culture of the 1950s. And I absolutely understand where Kalki Krishnamurti was coming from. He's writing in a milieu of linguistic imposition and debates erupting about linguistic states being demarcated. And he wants to help create this sense of Tamil identity and Tamil historical self. There's this fascinating interview with Gauri Ramnarayan, Kalki's granddaughter and translator, where she talks about why did Kalki write about the character of Arulmozhivarman in a particular way. According to him, Kalki wanted him to have the humility of Gandhi, the steel of Patel, the erudition of Nehru, etc., etc. Now, in hindsight, I'm not sure all these figures had all those qualities, of course. But the point is that is how Kalki saw them, or at least those are the qualities that he wanted a medieval king to reflect. Now, I think that the medieval kings want us to believe they had those qualities, for sure, but that's not always supported by the evidence. The thing we have to remember is that power loves telling stories about itself. Power loves to disguise itself. It likes to present the iron fist in the velvet glove, to use a cliche, right? So no king, I mean, actually, a lot of medieval kings talk a lot about the violence they unleash on their enemies. And then in the next line, they'll talk about, oh, and I love God so much, and I have given such and such gift to such and such temple. And we today are focused entirely on the devotional aspect. And somehow there's this cognitive dissonance where we don't think about the warfare and violence that was linked up to medieval devotion. I think it's an amazing thing that civilizationally and culturally we have managed to shed that necessity. We delinked religion and we delinked political violence and religious devotion. And I don't think we should underestimate what a remarkable achievement that was. We really underestimate how prevalent warfare was 1,000 years ago. In South Karnataka especially, there's hero stones in practically every village that's talking about young men dying in cattle raids, being eaten alive by leopards, being gored by wild boars, protecting women from thieves, protecting women from raiders, so on and so forth, right? And this is not to say gendered violence is not still a massive challenge. But the point is that it was so ubiquitous that there would be battles between villages. And for that constant low-level violence to be eradicated required the transformation of political authority, it required the transformation of our very concept of the state, it required the expansion of like judicial institutions, which were a truly remarkable process for India to have undergone, especially in the 20th century. So this is a bit of a rambling answer to your question. The TLDR is, yes, I did read Ponniyin Selvan, and it actually got me into a lot of trouble because I think that so much of what we think we know about the Cholas is really what we know about Ponniyin Selvan. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. Thank you.